There was a time when Spain held the world in its hands. In the 16th century, it wasn't Britain that ruled the seas or claimed the title of the largest empire on earth. It was Spain. For the first time in human history, one crown commanded a global dominion that stretched from Europe to Africa, from the Americas to the far reaches of Asia. The empire's reach was so vast that people began to say, "The sun never sets on Spanish soil." But there's a cruel irony buried in that glory, because the wealth that made Spain the envy of the world also became the poison that destroyed it. The richest empire humanity had ever seen collapsed under the weight of its own treasure. And this isn't just a story about kings and conquests. It's a warning that still echoes today, because we keep mistaking sudden wealth for lasting prosperity. And every time we do, the fall that follows is devastating. When Spain stumbled into the New World after 1492, it thought it had found heaven itself. What began as exploration quickly turned into a fever, a gold fever. After Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in 1521, Spain gained access to the mines of Zacatecas and the wealth of Mexico. A decade later, Francisco Pizarro's defeat of the Inca Empire opened the gates to Potosi, a mountain so rich in silver it was said to have consumed the lives of 8 million miners over the centuries. The locals called it the mountain that eats men. For more than 100 years, ships laden with gold and silver crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported an estimated 180,000 tons of silver and 2,000 tons of gold. More silver than all of Europe had mined in the previous 1,000 years combined. Imagine that. A single nation controlling a treasure greater than anything the medieval world had dreamed possible. This wealth didn't just reshape Europe, it reshaped the planet. From the ports of Seville and Cadiz, Spanish ships carried bullion east to the Mediterranean, north to the Low Countries, and west across the Pacific to Manila. There, silver was traded for Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices. For the first time in human history, money circled the globe. The first truly global economy was born, and Spain sat proudly at its center. To grasp how far ahead Spain was, consider this. When the English established Jamestown in 1607, their first permanent colony in America, it was little more than a swamp infested with disease and failure. But across the sea, Mexico City already had cathedrals, universities, and printing presses. Lima was a thriving urban center. Even in Florida, the Spanish city of St. Augustine had been standing since 1565. 40 years before Jamestown. Spain wasn't just exploring, it was building. It had roads, ports, cathedrals, fortresses, and trade routes that spanned half the world. While England and France were still fumbling with failed colonies, Spain was operating a global infrastructure that connected continents. But beneath the grandeur, something was going wrong. Because Spain had confused treasure with wealth. It thought that having more gold meant having more power, and that's where its story turns from triumph to tragedy. At first, it seemed like Spain's golden age would last forever. But the silver that poured in from the Americas was doing something invisible, something corrosive. Prices began to rise, slowly at first, then uncontrollably. Between 1500 and 1600, inflation quadrupled. Ordinary Spaniards, farmers, craftsmen, laborers, found their wages buying less and less. Bread cost more, clothing cost more. Life itself became harder to afford. How could this happen to the richest nation on earth? The answer is simple. Money only has value when it's scarce and trusted. When a flood of new currency enters an economy without a matching increase in goods or productivity, prices rise. Imagine a town where one coin buys a loaf of bread. Suddenly 10 times more coins appear, but the number of loaves stays the same. Bakers raise prices because people have more coins to spend. Soon, bread costs 5 or 6 coins. Bread didn't become more valuable. The money became less so. That's what happened to Spain. Economists now call it the price revolution. The first great global inflation, triggered by too much silver chasing too few goods. The wealthy, nobles, merchants, and bankers were shielded. They handled silver first before prices adjusted. The poor were crushed. Their wages stood still while costs soared. The more silver Spain imported, the poorer its people became. The empire that sat on mountains of silver couldn't feed its own people. The problem wasn't just inflation, it was what Spain did with its treasure. Instead of using the wealth to build industries, improve agriculture, or invest in long-term productivity, Spain spent it. It imported luxuries from Italy and the Low Countries. Fine cloth, furniture, weapons, art, all paid for with silver from the New World. While foreign merchants grew rich, Spain's own industries withered. Why build factories when treasure ships arrived every year? Why innovate when gold could buy everything you needed? Spain became a consumer, not a creator. It built palaces instead of workshops, armadas instead of businesses. Then came the wars. Endless, expensive wars. Spain's Habsburg kings saw themselves as God's chosen defenders of Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation. Their sense of divine mission came with a colossal price tag. American silver-funded wars against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean financed armies that tried to crush the Protestant Dutch revolt and poured into the bloody chaos of the French Wars of Religion. It built the massive Spanish Armada in 1588, a fleet meant to invade and conquer Protestant England. That fleet failed. The loss was not just military, it was financial shock therapy. The cost was astronomical, and the failure left the Spanish treasury in ruins. Yet the wars continued. The 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, devoured resources at a terrifying pace, and every ship of silver that arrived in Seville was already spent before it docked. Here's the cruelest irony of all. The silver didn't stay in Spain. It flowed through the empire like water through a sieve. The crown used it to pay Italian shipbuilders, Flemish traders, and German bankers, enriching the very nations that would soon replace Spain as world powers. Every new shipment made foreign, creditors wealthier and Spain weaker. The empire's own economy was hollowed out from within, and yet Spain couldn't stop. It was addicted to its treasure fleets, just as modern economies become addicted to credit or printed money. When the ships arrived, debts were paid and confidence returned. When they sank or were captured, panic spread. The entire financial system hinged on a few wooden vessels crossing the ocean. To keep its wars and palaces running, Spain began borrowing, not against what it had, but against what it expected to receive. German bankers like the Fuggers, and later the Genoese financiers, loaned vast sums to the crown in exchange for rights to future treasure shipments. It worked until it didn't. When a fleet was delayed, sunk, or captured, Spain couldn't pay. And so came the defaults. 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 4 bankruptcies in half a century. Imagine being the wealthiest empire on earth and still having to tell your creditors, "We can't pay you back." That was Spain, and then came the pirates, not mere criminals, but instruments of economic warfare. England and the Netherlands realized they didn't need to fight Spain directly. They could attack its treasure fleets instead. In the 1580s, English privateer Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, raiding Spanish ships and returning home with treasure worth half of England's annual income. The Dutch followed suit. In 1628, Piet Hein captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet off Cuba, 11 million guilders of silver. Each time a fleet was lost, Spain's economy trembled. Credit collapsed, soldiers went unpaid, and the empire lurched toward another default. England and the Netherlands reinvested their stolen silver into navies, banks, and trade companies, building systems of wealth that multiplied over time. Spain's lifeline became its weakness. By the early 1600s, Spain still looked powerful on maps. Its empire stretched across oceans. Its cathedrals were lined with gold. Its kings ruled from magnificent palaces, but it was an illusion. Inside, the foundations were collapsing. Inflation, eroded living standards, taxes grew unbearable, debt swallowed revenue, and wars consumed every ounce of silver that arrived from across the seas, where the Spanish people lived poor lives under the richest empire on earth. And as Spain stumbled, its rivals took notes. The English, Dutch, and later the French learned from Spain's mistakes. They saw that true wealth didn't come from hoarding treasure. It came from systems, trade, banking, manufacturing, and investment. Spain's colonies existed to extract and send wealth home. England's colonies existed to create wealth where they were. The difference was everything. Spain's model was finite. Britain's was self-sustaining. One ran on plunder, the other ran on production. And history shows which one lasts. By the mid-1600s, Spain's decline was visible to everyone. The once mighty Armada was a shadow of its past glory. Inflation and repeated bankruptcies had destroyed confidence in the crown. The 30 Years' War drained its resources and prestige. The Dutch Republic declared independence and built a commercial empire. England's navy dominated the seas. Spain still owned vast territories, but it no longer had the financial muscle to defend them. The empire that once terrified Europe was now exhausted, bankrupt and dependent on foreign credit. And yet, Spain's collapse wasn't just about kings' wars or silver. It was about a deeper truth, one that still matters today. When floods of money enter a system, whether through conquest, debt, or modern printing presses, the illusion of wealth takes hold. People feel richer, nations act bolder, governments borrow more. But without productivity, discipline, and real investment, that wealth corrodes everything it touches. Spain's peasants saw it firsthand. The more silver that arrived, the higher bread prices climbed. Today, workers see it when inflation eats away at their wages while governments assure them the economy is strong. Even the pirates have their modern counterparts. Spain's treasure fleets concentrated all its wealth into fragile convoys. Today, our economies concentrate wealth into giant banks and financial systems that are too big to fail. When one collapses, the shock ripples outward. Just like when a treasure fleet went down. The names change, but the pattern doesn't. Spain's loss to Piet Hein in 1628 was no different from a financial crash. Today, a single event revealing the fragility of an entire system built on borrowed confidence. The lesson Spain left behind is brutal but clear. Treasure is not wealth, gold is not power, silver is not security. Real wealth comes from systems, from the ability to produce, create, and sustain value over time. Spain believed that owning half the world and endless silver meant power forever. In reality, it meant fragility. Its rivals, England and the Netherlands, understood the deeper game. Build institutions, banks and industries that multiply wealth even in times of scarcity. And because they did, They inherited the future. Spain's story is a mirror. Every society that confuses money for value walks the same path. Rich in the short term, hollow in the long run. The richest empire the world had ever known collapsed not from invasion, but from illusion. It drowned in its own gold. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And if we listen closely, Spain's fall still whispers a warning that when easy money flows and discipline fades, collapse is already on the horizon. If this story opened your eyes, stay tuned. History doesn't just tell us what happened, it shows us what always happens.